There's a quote that is often attributed to Winston Churchill, in which he said that to an audience that he regretted that he did not have time to prepare a short speech, and so he prepared a long one instead. My current situation with these videos is not really due to a lack of preparation, but if I had taken more time to sort of plan out how I was going to do this and how I was going to discuss this topic, I would have staged everything differently than I did. And it's only in trying to put all this together that I realized that this is going to run a lot longer than I thought it was going to. This is going to end up being a 3-part series. Sorry, guys, I didn't want videos 3, 4, and 5 to be a 3-part series for for such a new channel, but that's kind of going to be how it's going to end up happening. I do hope that you bear with me and that you do like the content. One consequence of this, not only because life events kind of got into the way at an inconvenient moment, which also delayed the release of this a bit, but another consequence of this is that I think I'm going to go to a 1-month release schedule instead of the bi-weekly release schedule. Not because I can't prepare these videos in a 2-week time frame, but more because I think that having that month is going to help me plot out exactly what I want to do with these videos better to sort of avoid this type of thing in the future. So nonetheless, I hope that you enjoy this video. Please like and subscribe if you do. Let's get right into it. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't first talk a little bit about the Progressive Era, since it did have quite an impact on politics in the late 19th and through the early and mid-20th century. The Progressive Era really kicked off with the candidacy of William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 presidential election. Bryan was running against William McKinley. And unfortunately today, if you know William Jennings Bryan from much of anything from your high school history classes, it was probably as being the attorney for the anti-evolutionary side in the Scopes trial in Tennessee. That's true. I mean, he did do that. But for most of his career, Bryan was a passionate defender of the rights of working people and the top leader of the populist movement in the United States. In 1896, Bryan ran a very strong campaign in opposition to social, economic, and cultural elites in the United States. A lot of his main support came from the interior of the country. A lot of it was very agrarian-based. However, he did have a lot of support in mining communities, in small factory mill towns. Ultimately, his first it was really the first mass action, mass movement campaign that the United States had seen in an awfully long time, since the Republicans ran in 1860. But it also produced a very strong backlash from the very wealthy, from the robber barons, who spent the equivalent of what today would be hundreds of millions of dollars in a campaign against Bryan. They engaged in intimidation tactics against people who might vote for Bryan, and they also, in a lot of cases, just went out and told their workers, hey, if you go out and vote for Bryan and he wins, the factory's closed tomorrow and you won't have a job. Among many other things, Bryan ran against the gold standard as a standard for the money. If you go back to the last video, we discussed sort of the true political relevance of that question. It's not just a weird niche issue. It actually has a lot of consequences. I will put a link in the doobly-doo, but you should really go and listen to Bryan's Cross of Gold speech, not only because it's a great synthesis of the principles that he ran on, opposition to the gold standard, opposition to elitism, but it is also one of America's great political speeches. And it was a speech that he gave at the convention for the Democratic Party, and then also he had repeated it several other times while he was out campaigning. So Bryan loses in 1896. He came within about 4% in the popular vote. It was a much larger electoral college loss, but it was not, he wasn't defeated in a landslide. And because of his candidacy and the popular momentum that it built, and as I said, a lot of intimidation and a lot of money had to be spent to diffuse it, but also because his candidacy was also the product of a number of political movements that had been going on at the time. There was a shift in the politics of the country. That gets us to the progressive era. And, the progressivism in America itself could very easily be a future video. But for now, I think the key points are that progressivism itself was not a unified cause. There was no unified ideology. The progressive movement pretty much just started as a reaction to robber baron capitalism. And aside from a general conviction that the public sphere should act to advance or progress some notion of the public good in the future, people just basically just slapped that one unifying idea atop of whatever other ideology they believed in. And so progressivism was really more of, it was an expression that you believed in an activist government, but that was about it. That's why when we get to the 1912 election, Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt are all running claiming to be progressives, even though their ideologies are quite different. I presume that if you're listening to this video, then you know about women's suffrage, trust busting, and the push to abolish child labor, all of which were issues that were settled right during this period. But while all that stuff is very important and the struggles to secure those rights were very real, by a third of the way into this period that we're discussing, all that stuff had at least token support from almost every political faction, except really wealthy landowners and a lot of the most out-of-touch factory owners and conservative moralists. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about them other than to just tip my cap and recognize that those were issues. Bryan's run in 1896 had another major consequence in terms of the political fate of the United States, which is that while this would readjust somewhat and it wouldn't hold throughout the decades, and I'll get more into that later, from this point forward, since Bryan ran as a Democrat, populist forces, working class based forces, political forces in this country, tended to default more towards the Democratic Party than towards the Republican Party nationwide. And this, they have a very significant effect on the political coalitions moving forward. And by running the type of campaign that he ran, Bryan wasn't just, in his coalition, we're not just rejecting these type of big business aligned meritocratic Republicans from the half-breed coalition who I'd mentioned in the previous video. It wasn't just them, but he was also running in rejection of the Southern planter class Democrats and their allies in the North, who by this point had taken on the name Bourbon Democrats. And this election really marked the beginning of their decline within the Democratic coalition, as along with this rise in the power of these working class interests within the Democratic coalition. And so this now brings us to the final major shift in the American political geography that would get us to the political system that would come to dominate most of the 20th century. And that was the Great Migration. Now, when we left off in the South in the last video, we saw that the end of Reconstruction brought back not a total an immediate return to the sort of white supremacist norm that had dominated the South before the Civil War, but it took about a decade, 2 decades to finally settle back in and come back. And but when it set in for a very long time, and it was clear at this point that the anti-black politics of the South had won the argument. And so around 1910, between 1910 and 1940, we saw a very large movement with new opportunities that were opening up in the North and factories. There was a very large movement of black families from the South into northern cities. So this is in both the Northeast and the Midwest. And then there was a second Great Migration, as it's often termed, that occurred that saw a similar movement but out to the West Coast. So by this point, the picture that you should have of both America's political processes and political culture and also the political parties is not one clear, coherent thing, but rather layerings of a patchwork of several different competing interests and ideas and historical accidents that all just happen to come together into one thing that roughly resembles something that's coherent when we're looking at it through the rearview mirror. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to split the United States into 4 separate regions: the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West. When we last left off in our previous video, I had mentioned that in the Northeast, the dominant faction within the Democratic Party were the Irish-American political machines, such as Tammany Hall. In the South, the politics in the Democratic Party were largely dominated by the wealthy planter class and the landowning elite. This remained true basically through the entirety of the period that we're going to be talking about here, although there were some shakeups towards the end of the period that we'll talk about. In the Northeast, the predominant opposition to the Irish political machines were the liberal Republicans, sometimes called the Eastern Establishment, or much later Rockefeller Republicans. In order to avoid confusion, I'm going to call them the Eastern Establishment for the purposes of these videos. Now, the Eastern Establishment was a interesting element within the Republican Party, in that it was comprised of Republicans who generally had far more liberal cultural attitudes and found common cause with a number of the later arriving immigrant groups who came into the region. They were aligned with a number of the African Americans who came up as part of the Great Migration, and also with a lot of later Italian immigrants who came over starting in the 1890s and then on through the 1920s and 1930s. Many of the prominent figures of the Eastern Establishment were folks who were the sort of political heads of these old Yankee dynasties that controlled the area. And so a lot of them had very strong ties to international finance capital, a lot of ties across the ocean. A lot of these folks unironically spoke with what we now kind of consider the sort of mid-Atlantic accent that you hear in a lot of old movies. They were less hostile to, as I said, immigrants and migrants in general, but also to the idea of political programs and social improvements. Now, they weren't radical by any stretch of the imagination. They were not social democrats. They tended to view their support and participation in these programs with sort of noblesse oblige type attitude. And oftentimes their goal in supporting these programs was less to create large power shifts than it was to prevent those from happening by kind of providing the minimum of social services. A lot of them supported aspects of the New Deal, but were oppositional to the New Deal as a whole into Roosevelt himself because they thought that Roosevelt was trying to bring about socialism. A number of the key figures in this group were Thomas Dewey, Prescott Bush, and then later Nelson Rockefeller and those who were connected to the Rockefeller dynasty. Though later they did start bringing in some folks who were direct representatives of the immigrant groups that they had aligned themselves with, such as Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the mayor of New York. There may have been some genuine and sincere affinity toward these migrant groups from the sort of wealthy patrician old Puritan class, but the reality of the matter is that they needed these voters in order to remain competitive to balance out the Irish vote. Now, I say this speaking as someone who is a proud Irish American. There was a lot of animosity from the Irish toward blacks and towards Italians throughout almost the entirety of the period that we're going to be talking about. A lot of bigotry and persecution and violence. Some of this was just genuine bigotry and hatred and racism that you're always going to see from some people towards some people. A lot of this, though, was also fueled directly by the political class and people who had money going to Irish households and their Irish employees when new immigrant groups would come in and say, hey, that guy's going to take your job, or now you're competing with housing and resources with these other people who just came here, and doesn't that irk you? Doesn't that make you angry? Or just cutting wages because they were able to pay black employees and Italian employees less money, and then saying, well, it's because they're scabs and they're willing to work for less. There really is nothing new under the sun. The same things that people say about low-wage migrants today are the same things that they were saying a century ago and have been repeated throughout time. But as far as the Democratic Party is concerned, the Irish bloc really did control much of the institutions of the party and a lot of the civic institutions in the large urban centers in these states during this time period. There were a lot of places where you couldn't get a job in the fire department or the police department or a lot of civic agencies unless you were Irish or had strong ties to the Irish voting bloc. And so that was in the Northeast. That was the basic breakdown. You had these Eastern establishments, culturally liberal, economically center to center right, depending upon the issue, Republicans versus the Irish political establishment. And as I'd said before, throughout the South, nothing really had changed. Political power was almost exclusively held by large landowners, descendants of the planter aristocracy. They, as I said, had exclusive rights to political power during this time period. You did see some small movements crop up occasionally. One very notable exception is the Huey Long organization in Louisiana, which is notable because Long put his focus on building a biracial coalition, and he actually paid attention to the needs of black voters who were part of that coalition and worked on delivering real quality of life improvements and civic improvements for all people who were living in the state, but that was very much the exception to the rule. The Midwest was, again, an entirely different situation altogether. And for the purposes of this video, I am probably going to make the most controversial statement that I will ever make, and that is I am including Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
We're from the town with the great football team. We cheer the Pittsburgh Steelers. Winning's a habit, not only a dream. Go out and get them Steelers.
But also Buffalo, New York, and Rochester in with the rest of the Midwest. A lot of people have a lot of feelings about this. I think that it's pretty clear that economically, culturally, socially, Pittsburgh is a Midwestern city. And if anyone feels really that upset about this, then you're welcome to come and meet me in the parking lot of Heinz Field and fight me. But in general, there were three groups who tended to dominate the politics of this area. The first group were mine workers and factory workers in the mining and mill towns, and also in the large cities that were supported by those towns. This group tended to very strongly support the Democratic Party, although they did support the Republican Party in some areas, especially if the Republican Party was more connected to the final group I'm going to talk about of this three-part set. A lot of these folks were immigrants, especially later on as the Great Migration progressed. A lot of black households and African American voters identified along with this bloc and therefore with the Democratic Party. And this is a good time to talk about an often discussed issue within American politics, and that is when did the Great Switch happen? The Great Switch being the change in voter identification for black voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. There's been a lot of study and a lot of great work into the topic of black American political power in the early 20th century. Dr. Kenesha Grant's done a lot of great work that you should take a look at if you have an opportunity. But essentially, the argument tends to break down along two lines. The conservative line is that the Great Switch happened after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and after the Great Society. And the argument here is essentially that black voters were duped into voting for the Democratic Party by LBJ. And that this is somehow illegitimate because the Civil Rights Act was more supported by Republicans than by Democrats. We'll get into that, but I think you can kind of figure out by the end of this where I'm going to be going with that argument. The second, more thoroughly researched position is that the Great Switch happened after the New Deal. And when the New Deal came about, black voters just kind of switched en masse to the Democratic Party and to FDR, along with all the other working class voters in the country. My argument is that there was never any Great Switch. Prior to the Great Migration, almost all black Americans were concentrated in the South, where they had no ability to vote, they had no access to the political process whatsoever. Once the Great Migration happened in the 19-teens and 1920s, by the end of the 1920s, African-American households were voting overwhelmingly for FDR and the Democratic Party. So if there was any period of time in which they were voting Republican, it was a tiny, tiny window. So no votes means no switch. There was no identity prior to, or rather no political identity prior to FDR and the New Deal and the Great Migration. So there's no switch at all. It just simply never happened. As with the Northeast, there was a lot of migration and immigration into the Midwest during this period. And this is coming both from European countries, especially from Southern Europe, and also from the American South. If you recall from the last video, I had mentioned that nativists and anti-immigrant groups were a large part of the original Republican coalition. And especially in the lower Midwest, they maintained a lot of sway and power within the Republican coalition during the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. These groups tended to be in rural areas and also especially in areas that were just outside of these mining towns and factory towns that were springing up and bringing in new immigrants. Very culturally conservative, not just in terms of opposition to immigrants, but also in terms of trying to preserve, what they would have seen as Christian values and Christian norms. Although, of course, almost all of the people who were coming in were also Christians, but they weren't the right kind of Christians in these folks' minds. And so they tended to trade it off on a lot of fear-mongering about the cultural customs and moral decay, as they saw it, of these urban centers. So that's our second large group that of the groups that we're talking about here, and it's one of the biggest that tended to align with the Republican Party. These folks also tended to be very fiscally conservative. Were strongly opposed to any type of social programs or civic improvements. They are the sort of rugged individualists who would later play a major role in forming America's political conscience later on down the road. Interestingly, most of the original rugged individualists didn't come from the American West, they came from the Midwest. And their attitudes and politics were very much informed by that. But this era is also notable, and area are also notable for the second birth of the Ku Klux Klan. This was in the 19-teens and 1920s. The Klan during this period was not centered on the American South. It was in the Midwest. Indiana was a state whose politics were almost entirely dominated by Klan activity during this time period, and the Klan very closely aligned with the Republican Party. It also aligned with the Republican Party in Michigan, where it held a lot of sway, Southern Illinois, where they held a lot of sway, and into Ohio, and also Pennsylvania and upstate New York. Then our third and final group from the Midwest are genuine progressive Republicans. I had mentioned in the last video that there were some left-wing Republican holdouts during this time period, especially in the upper Midwest, although also, there were figures around Pittsburgh and Cleveland who tended to identify with this more progressive Republican strain. And these folks tended to concentrate most specifically in the upper Midwest, so Wisconsin, Minnesota, but also in the North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, even in Kansas. This faction was fairly prominent for a long time. This group differed in some ways significantly from the liberal Republicans of the Eastern Establishment, who we had talked about before. As I had said, the Eastern Establishment, their politics were focused much more on noblesse oblige and kind of alliances of convenience with a number of immigrant groups. They tended to represent a much wealthier and more established interest within politics. And really their focus was on maintaining the status quo, whereas the progressive Republicans of the upper Midwest were very concerned with economic and cultural and social equality, and in power redistribution, and in upsetting the status quo. As time went on, while a lot of these folks did still vaguely identify with the Republican Party at the national level, they started to form their own political organizations and even started aligning with people who were running on the socialist ticket. In Minnesota, they eventually formed the Farmer Labor Party, and so there was a lot of opposition and a lot of friction between this group of Republicans and the conservative Republicans, who tended to dominate a number of the more rural areas in the lower Midwest. And these weren't entirely exclusive. There was some overlap, and that led to a lot of three-way splits in elections throughout the Midwest during this time period. And that finally gets us to the West. And politics in the West pretty much broke down to two different factions, big business and the little guy. The big business interests were, of course, the literal large business owners, but then also mine owners, large ranchers, folks like that. And then the little guy were the small farmers, mine workers, factory workers. And because of the dynamic demographic situation of people who are moving in from all over the country, which groups aligned with what party, when and where changed all the time. And so in one state, it was not uncommon in the same decade to have one governor who represented the extreme faction, say a very conservative Republican governor, and then later on that decade, you would have a very progressive Republican governor, or you would have a Democrat governor who operated more like a member of the Southern landowning class. And then later on in that decade, you would have a Democrat who was a Midwestern, more union-aligned Democrat. This type of thing happened all the time. It created a very dynamic political situation. But this sort of idea of this conflict between these groups was very, very formative to politics in the Western United States. If you ever go back and watch a lot of old Western movies from before, the late 1950s, the notion of conflict between the little guy and large landowners or mine owners is foundational to a lot of those Western stories, and kind of went away in the late 1950s and 60s for reasons that we'll be discussing later. Or we might kind of touch upon the reasons for that later. But if you ever go back and watch those Westerns, a lot of them are based around this conflict, and this conflict was very real during this time period. Another conflict that was very real, unfortunately, were attitudes towards migrants. Again, a lot of Chinese immigration. And this attitude did create a climate of paranoia that was a prominent feature of politics in this area. And so, with all of that on the table now, to hammer in the point that I teased with the title of this video, when you look at it, when you look at all these different groups all splayed out like this, you see that there were no united political parties during this time period. There were multiple different factions that all basically resembled completely separate political parties and completely separate political interests. Now, at times they could get along, but there was a lot of opposition in and amongst and between these different groups. So, as I'd mentioned before, even in the Midwest, the progressive Republicans and the conservative Republicans hated each other. But the conservative Republicans also hated the Eastern establishment. And then, in addition to that, the progressive Republicans tended to eye the Eastern establishment with some understandable skepticism given their own interests. So when we're looking at all of these different groups that are basically strung together under one party apparatus due to a bunch of historical accidents from, at this point, half a century prior, how did they interact with each other? What was the political landscape during this period? As I had mentioned before, by the 19-teens, the idea of progressiveness, the idea that government should be used to progress a general good towards some sort of end was very popular. So much so that the big three candidates in the election of 1912 all ran as progressives. Wilson ran as a progressive, Roosevelt ran as a progressive, and Taft ran as a progressive. But they all had very different outlooks from one another. There was a fourth candidate in that race, Eugene Debs. He was the only one who wasn't running as a progressive because he was running as a socialist. But due to his background, Wilson was able to present himself as sort of a fusion between sort of northeastern liberal interests because he had been involved in academia, and Southern large landowning interests. And so he was able to prevail in that very divisive election. Then we get to the election of 1916. And again, both of the major candidates in this race are running as progressives. Though, unlike Taft, who was trying to shop himself as a progressive conservative, essentially, Charles Evans Hughes, who was the Republican candidate in that race, was running as sort of a more leftist Teddy Roosevelt progressive. The convention, the Republican convention of 1916, was sort of the last hurrah for the left progressive Republicans, who were able to play the kingmaker, join up with the Eastern establishment, and force their candidate with the opposition of the conservative Republicans from the Midwest. In fact, this is one of the very few elections when, during this period, when Ohio actually went for the Democrat. They went for Wilson because at this point Wilson was acting as the more, quote, conservative progressive. After the election of 1916, the conservative faction became more prominent within the Republican Party, and they started to gain a lot of steam. And towards the end of Wilson's term, when a lot of people were starting to become disaffected with the idea of progressivism, partly because of backlash against the American involvement in the First World War, but then also because of racialized backlash against the Great Migration and against immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then finally, because of paranoia that was fueled by what had happened in Russia with the communist revolution there. And so in 1920, the conservative Republicans aligned with the Eastern establishment, rather, and were able to force Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge as the ticket. The progressive Republicans did not support Harding or Coolidge, but they didn't really have a horse in this race because Cox, who was the Democratic candidate, with his running mate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would become important later on, didn't really present a suitable alternative. A lot of black civil rights organizations and labor unions were also gutted by Red Summer, which involved the Emmett Till murder, but there were many other instances of violence across the country, racialized violence at that time, and the linking of civil rights and union activity with communism. We get what's called the first Red Scare that burned throughout the early 1920s. And the first Red Scare directly targeted, as I said, a lot of blacks who were moving north, but also labor organizers who were aligned with socialist causes and also progressives. And when I say targeted, I mean there was real violence, real suppression, a real attitude of fear. In 1924, largely because of this, the Democrats split very decisively over who their nominee would be, and they ended up nominating John W. Davis, who was an ardent segregationist from West Virginia. He was the choice of the landowning class of the South, but really not too many other groups. And so a number of the progressive Republicans and labor Democrats ended up supporting the candidacy of Fighting Bob La Follette, who ran his own separate progressive candidacy apart from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And in a number of northern states, especially in western states, La Follette came in second. It had very strong showings, oftentimes in the 30 to 40% range in a lot of those states. But as a whole, Southern Democrats tried to actively suppress the Labor Democrats and the Irish political machines in the Northeast within the Democratic Party during this time period. Then in 1928, the Democrats nominated Al Smith, who was a Catholic from New York. Smith was also something of a proto-New Dealer, at least at first. He supported a lot of progressive initiatives and progressive policies. And in that election, the wealthy Southern faction of the Democratic Party, a lot of them refused to support the Democratic candidate, who they saw as the candidate of the corrupt Irish political machines and the socialist labor voters in the North. But the fact that they weren't able to block a candidate who they so bitterly opposed shows their already diminishing power within the National Party, even at this time. And so Herbert Hoover, who was the Republican candidate, who was seen as something of a progressive at the time, he wasn't actually really very clear on what his exact policies were, but he was able to break up the Solid South, and a number of southern states went for Hoover. And the Democratic Party had some of its worst showings in its history in the South between the Civil War and between the 1970s during that period. Meanwhile, because Hoover kind of presented himself as a sort of soft progressive, he was popular with the Midwestern conservatives because of his background. He was popular with the Eastern establishment. But the progressive Republicans basically split between Smith and Hoover. And because of the deep, unresolvable, it seemed, animosity between the different factions of the Democratic Party, it kind of looked at this point like the Republicans were headed towards some sort of a permanent majority, or that there would need to be a very serious alignment for the Democrats to become competitive again. And then the Great Depression happened. And the Great Depression and the New Deal broke, in massive quotation marks, the American political system. So we get this guy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, happy days are near again, the skies above are clear again, who had been the governor of New York. During his time as governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt really just continued a lot of Al Smith's policies from when Al Smith was governor. And originally, FDR was somewhat non-committal. He, not unlike Hoover, he kind of ran as sort of a soft progressive who generally wanted to adopt policies that would help Americans out of the Great Depression. But as the campaign went on, the Depression deepened. Roosevelt and the people around him realized that drastic action would be required in order to pull America out of this crisis. And so late in the presidential campaign, and then after the election, before the inauguration, FDR started to assemble what became to be known as his brain trust. The brain trust is something that a number of Democratic presidents have tried to reassemble since Kennedy, Carter, Obama. But the one ingredient that all these other Democratic presidents have missed, for reasons that we will discuss later, is that a number of folks in FDR's original brain trust were not seen as respected academics or professionals in their fields. They were seen as cranks. Harold Ickes, Frances Perkins, who was the first woman ever to be in a cabinet, she was FDR's labor secretary. Louis Brandeis, while he was a Supreme Court justice, was oftentimes very much a minority on the court. And Henry Wallace. All these folks were outsiders who had big, wild ideas for the time and were willing to try new things. But the ideas that they went with proved to be very popular. And so throughout the country, there was a massive realignment of all working class interests towards the Democratic Party. Throughout the North, Irish communities, Italian communities, black communities, small farmers, labor Democrats, progressive Republicans were all able to put aside their differences and unite under one banner. At this point, progressive Republicans bolted the Republican Party entirely and just became the progressive faction of the Democratic Party. In the South, you didn't see a lot of big changes right away. The wealth controlling class in the South, the big landowners, and the people connected to them still retained political power. But FDR was able to keep these folks on side by awarding large projects that the politicians were able to take back to their districts and made them very popular with the working class voters in their own districts. Something that I will address a little bit more, I think, in the next video, is that there was a blind spot within FDR's policy when it came to civil rights and racial relations, but his economic policies, while they were not directed at social and racial equality, did help raise a lot of black families who were in the working class out of absolute poverty. In terms of the 8 political factions that we've discussed, the one that was most heavily affected by the New Deal policies was probably the conservative Republicans of the Midwest. In the congressional elections in 32 and in 34, they were absolutely obliterated. However, despite this fact, when the Republicans gathered for their convention in 1936, they still had a lot of those big business interests on their side. And a lot of those big business interests viewed Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal and his policies as being a tyranny on par with the type of tyranny that they saw in rising in Europe, although a lot of these guys actually supported Hitler and Mussolini. But popularly, they sold it as a type of tyranny that you saw rising in Europe. FDR actually lost a lot of support from a number of the Southern Democratic members of Congress who had come in 32 or had already been there in 32 and elected in 32. But a lot of those guys just ended up getting replaced with new members of Congress. These people were still racists and still segregationists, but were much willing to work to get projects in their districts that furthered the interests of the people there and work within the New Deal system. Some of the Northeastern Democrats, such as Al Smith, also started opposing the New Deal and essentially sided themselves with the Eastern establishment. However, given the circumstances that I mentioned before with the big business interests involved, when the election of 1936 rolled around, Republicans thought that their best bet was to offer a very clear choice against the New Deal. And so they went with the conservative Republican Midwestern interests and nominated Alf Landon. Alf Landon was absolutely obliterated by FDR in that election. FDR's vote total in 36 actually rose substantially in a number of states. This was in no small part because when left-wing Democratic legislatures took over a number of these states in 32, they repealed a lot of those poll tax laws. Pennsylvania had actually gone to Herbert Hoover in 1932, I believe in no small part, if you actually break down the data and look at the county level data and you look at the counties that had poll taxes, because these poll taxes were in place. But then there was a big shift towards FDR in a number of these counties after that. The Republican vote in a number of these places also rose in terms of raw numbers, probably partly due to the repeal of these poll taxes. But this moment was the origin of a lot of Republican and conservative myths about Democrats only winning because they stuffed the ballot boxes. A number of polls that were taken before the 36 election actually had it being a lot closer than it ended up being, but this was due in no small part because of issues with the methodologies of the polls. They were calling, a lot of them were by phone, and so they were calling households. Households that were most affected by the Depression probably didn't have phones. And also they just weren't picking up a lot of people who were new voters because of the repeal of these taxes. However, the circumstances in 1936 did put some brakes on the New Deal, and in his second term, FDR was not able to get the same level of cooperation from Congress that he had in his first term, and so started responding to pressure from Congress and pulling back on a lot of New Deal programs. But at this point, it was very clear to the Republican Party that straight opposition to the New Deal wasn't going to work. And from this point on, the Eastern establishment was completely within the driver's seat of the Republican Party. However, there were rising tides of conservatism, a slightly different brand of conservatism that were rising in the Midwest and would come to define the Republican Party for the entirety of the rest of its history up until today. But more on that in the next video. In 1940, the Republicans nominated Wendell Willkie, who was a favorite of the Eastern establishment. And the tact of the Eastern establishment was not unlike what they had had before. They still supported civic programs, they still supported social programs, but they were critical of the New Deal as a larger project, again, aiming at the socialism angle and pressing fears of rising socialism. FDR, again, defeated the Republican nominee pretty handily. He lost Michigan in the 1940 election, partly because of a lot of money that was spent by Henry Ford to try to secure Michigan's votes for the Republican Party. The Eastern establishment again got their candidate in the 1944 election with Thomas Dewey, and Dewey performed better than the previous Republican candidates, but still lost by quite a substantial margin. But while at this point in time it appeared that the Eastern establishment was going to be completely unchallenged within the Republican Party for the near future, there were rising tides of growing conservatism within the party that would shape a lot of the direction of things to come. But for right now, as we're looking at this moment in American history, the New Deal coalition has effectively, without completely destroying this 8-party system, subverted a number of the internal contradictions within this system. In the next video, we'll talk about this rising conservative tide and sort of the unraveling and death of this 8-party system. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Thank you very much. Have a good day.